He's one of Canada's newest premiers, but he's no stranger to the political stage. First on the federal scene, where he held key portfolios in Stephen Harper's cabinets, Indian Affairs, Industry, Environment.
It is time for me to pursue new opportunities outside of public life.
Then in 2010, he withdrew from politics, went to Toronto, and one of the big banks, CIBC, as vice chair. But Alberta called him home in 2014, when the PC government was in crisis mode. No leader, no hope, according to the polls.
Over time, the government has lost its way. And watching from afar, I was as disappointed and as frustrated as anyone.
That's all different now with Premier Jim Prentice. But so is the province's challenge, with sinking oil prices, low revenues, and lost jobs. What's he going to do? And how's he going to do it? From Edmonton, Jim Prentice is our guest this week. You'll be happy to know that I've been reading some of your speeches from the past, both while you were in federal politics, when you were in the private sector, and since you've been premier.
It's a limited audience, you and I perhaps.
But as you know, it can sometimes, past speeches,
Right.
you can not necessarily regret things you said, but let me read you one thing. And I think you perhaps may have said this in jest, but it's kind of interesting in a sense. It's not about any specific issue. It's in the first year after federal politics, when you were at CIBC. In a speech you said, "I have the luxury now of speaking more frankly. It's fair to say I have accumulated a significant inventory of unexpressed opinions." So how frank are you going to be with me?
Very, very frank. That's right.
It must be
I also have the
difficult.
luxury of being the premier and expressing my point of view as premier. So,
But it's what do you mean when you say that?
well, I'm the Premier of Alberta, and I know there's
Right.
some important issues we need to talk about.
But
So,
when you're not the first minister, sometimes it can be limiting how far you can go in expressing your opinion.
well, you're the leader of the team as opposed to being a member of the team. But
All right. Well, let's be frank about exactly how dire the situation is for Alberta, given the incredible drop in oil prices.
well, dire is a strong word. It's a very serious time for us as a province, but we will get through it. There is going to be a few years of pain, undeniably. But this province is incredibly resilient, and we're essentially caught up at this point in a price war relative to the oil business. That's not the only industry that flourishes in our province, but it is a mainstay of our economy. But this will pass. I mean, the replacement cost of a barrel of oil is not $44, and so inevitably there will be higher prices. But what this has done is it's really disclosed some structural problems that we have in our public finances. It's disclosed the fact that we become far too dependent on taking oil revenue and subsidizing the cost of current services, and that, in a sense, we're not setting aside dollars for the benefit of our children and our grandchildren.
So I guess what you're suggesting then, the argument being that those oil revenues should be going into the Heritage Fund, not being used for day-to-day expenses.
Yeah, well, essentially what's happened, Peter, is if you go back, I mean, the original vision of the Heritage Fund that Premier Lougheed espoused was that, as I recall, 50% of the revenue would be set aside for future generations and to do positive things for the province. Starting in 1986, we began to divert that revenue into underwriting current public services. And essentially, every government since then has taken more, reaching the point this year where 100% of Alberta's oil revenue will basically underwrite current public services. And so we've ended up as a province with the best of everything in terms of public services, the most expensive of everything, most expensive staffing. Yet we've also at the same time had the lowest taxes of any jurisdiction in this country, something that we've taken a lot of pride in. But the plug number has been oil revenue. We've been able to do that by basically diverting oil revenue into underwriting the cost of public services. And Albertans, by and large, are saying to us, enough's enough. They want to see this change.
Well, they want to see it change, but how far can you go in that change? I mean, there are only certain ways you can deal with a deficit. You either cut services, or you raise taxes, or you do both.
Sure. You know, basically I've said we have three levers. We have a financial cushion. We have the best public finances in North America. We have a financial cushion. We have a contingency fund, so that will provide some shock absorber, if you will. But beyond that, you're quite right. Either we increase revenue or we decrease and compress public spending. And so it has to be a combination of those three things. And we're working on that right now.
Well, on that combination, how far are you willing to go, and in what areas are you willing to go on the tax front? I mean, you know this, you know what everybody talks about.
Right.
Alberta sales tax. They don't have one. Should they have one?
Well, Albertans have been very clear they don't want one. I mean, this is.
So is that issue off the table?
Well, listen, I've said that I don't support a sales tax. I did say 3 weeks or so ago that this is a serious debate for Albertans. People should speak their minds. You know, I certainly didn't expect this circumstance when I became the Premier, and I want to know what Albertans feel about it. So I said, if you know, express your point of view, including that of a sales tax. But I think Albertans have been very clear they don't want a sales tax. And
so is it off the table?
Essentially, I hear that loud and clear. People in this province don't want a sales tax. What they do want to see first and foremost is belt tightening on the part of the government. They know that the cost of public services in this province has outpaced anyone else in Canada. We've ended up with a wage structure that's the highest in the country. And you know, Albertans are prepared to shoulder their share of the burden in all this, but loud and clearly they're saying, we want to see government tighten its belt first.
Are there taxes other than a sales tax that could be introduced?
Well, we have to look at all the financial levers. I mean, some people talk about healthcare premiums, some people speak of gasoline taxes, people talk about sin taxes. There's a great debate taking place in our province about the merits of a flat tax versus a progressive tax.
Are all those on the table?
Everything is on the table in that sense, yes.
But the sales tax is not on the table.
Sales tax we've heard from people, and it's what I had expected. People take a lot of pride in the fact that Alberta doesn't have a sales tax and won't have a sales tax.
So you've just come out of a cabinet meeting. Should we assume that in a cabinet meeting, this is the kind of debate that's going on some of these areas that could involve new revenue?
Oh, certainly. And myself as Premier and the Cabinet agreed to a 5% pay cut effective immediately. You can't reasonably ask Albertans to shoulder part of the responsibility unless you do it yourself.
That won't impact.
That was a painful discussion.
I bet it was. So. It won't impact the payments on the 56 T-Bird, though, will it?
Well, that was paid for from personal resources,
right?
Which
no,
I'd saved for many years.
That. But, you know, and I understand that. But do you think it was wise at this time for that to happen? I mean, if you had your choice, would you want to do it now?
I was away with my family on a trip that I'd paid for by myself. And I'd been looking for one of those cars for the last 10 years, seriously for 5 years, and I found what I was looking for. I didn't try to create a lot of noise about it, but it was, you know, it was in a public auction, and I've actually received pretty supporting, you know, messages from Albertans about that.
But here's one of the most collectible of all the T-Birds, sold way up in the skybox.
When we come back, you believe that climate change is caused in some part by human use of
correct
fossil fuels,
anthropogenic,
right?
Carbon.
But you don't challenge that.
I don't challenge. I never have.
Do people around your cabinet table challenge that?
More with Alberta Premier Jim Prentice after this.
The province of Alberta itself already has it's one of the few GHG regulatory environments in the country. It has one. I think it's a model on which you could go broader.
This is the carbon levy?
This is the tech fund price carbon levy, and it's not a levy, it's a price, and there's a tech fund in which private sector makes investments. So look, that's what Alberta has done. That's a model that's available.
Let me talk about a different kind of tax. Some people don't call it a tax, they call it a levy. I think you call it a levy. The carbon levy that Alberta has, which has been extended 6 months.
Correct.
While you determine what to do. $15 per ton on heavy emitters. I'm not sure whether you heard, but the Prime Minister kind of sort of looked longingly at that in the Christmas interview. Have you had any discussions with him about that as a possibility on a broader scale?
Well, we've talked about the importance of our competitiveness, and I believe his views and mine have always been the same on that we can't damage our competitiveness. But, you know, as an Albertan and as the Premier, we have the challenge of rebranding Alberta. We have the challenge of stepping out into the continent and into the world at large and telling people about the things that we're doing on the environment. We have improvements to make for sure, and we're focused on that. But it's not just about the industrial carbon levy, as to use that term. It's about the suite of policies that we have relating to the environment and climate change. And it really comes down to this. I mean, we are in the oil business. We are one of the world's largest producers of oil. We are now the largest source of the imports into the United States of America is the province of Alberta, 25% of U.S. imports. We take a lot of pride in that, and we have a very good environmental record that we have been woefully inadequate in telling the world about. We do some incredible things in this province that we've not explained very well. You can't talk to any CEO in an energy company who won't tell you that the regime that they work under in Alberta is the most exacting in the world. And so we have to make sure people understand that.
I want to read you one other quote.
Sure.
Another speech you made also while you were out of politics. I think it was one of the first speeches you gave, actually, when you got to the bank. And you were talking about the environment. Let me be categoric. Neither industry nor the governments of Canada or Alberta can defend themselves in the absence of credible, science-based data that substantiates the fact that we are protecting the environment. Are we still at that point? That was 2011.
Sure. Well, I said substantially that when I was the Minister of the Environment, and I said the same thing.
But we haven't moved forward
repeatedly
on that front.
That speech, I did draw actually on words that I'd said as the Minister of Environment, and the precursor to those words was the creation of a new approach to monitoring in Alberta. And the origin of my thoughts on that were that I found I couldn't defend myself as the Minister of the Environment for Canada because we didn't have the scientific data. And so I'm passionate about this. If we are going to defend what we're doing in the oil sands, you have to have credible scientific data.
But we still don't have it.
It's coming along. It's not where it needs to be, and this needs to be a priority. It was something I pushed as the federal environment minister. Frankly, I would have thought it would be farther along than it is now. I think we're falling into the same circumstance we did previously. You have to have scientific data that's defensible if you're going to have strong environmental policies and if they're going to be defensible.
But you believe in science.
I believe in science, and I'm a passionate conservationist, as I'm sure you know from your research. I'm an avid fly fisherman. And I think that a bedrock value in my province is a love of the outdoors and a love of the environment and a desire to leave this province better than we found it.
But I guess the question on climate change is, and I know your record and I know your passion on this subject. Let's do some basics. You believe that climate change is caused in some part by human use of
Correct.
fossil fuels.
Anthropogenic
Right.
carbon.
But you don't challenge that.
I don't challenge. I never have.
Do people around your cabinet table challenge that?
I've not heard anybody in the room challenge that. Frankly, I don't. I think there's common acceptance of that we need to reduce emissions. We need to do it in a responsible way. Our province is in the energy business. Most of the provinces in Canada, in one way or another, actually are in the energy business, but no one more so than Alberta. And so we want to be a responsible producer of hydrocarbons. And do we support the gradual reduction of consumption of hydrocarbons and cleaner energy? Absolutely. But there's not a scientist in the world who would tell you that looking out to the next 50 years that the world won't continue to be very heavily dependent on exactly what we produce in Alberta and in Canada. And so we want to be good at it.
Did the same belief exist around the cabinet tables you sat at in Ottawa? The universal belief that climate change was at least in part caused that way?
I think so, for the most part. I mean, I can't speak for everybody who was sitting at the table, but but I don't think the government took a position that disagreed with the science. My own views as Premier of Alberta, I have a very strong passion about the adoption of technology and being science-based, and I think it's the only way that we will be able to justify what we're doing and explain what we're doing.
Still to come.
We have had 17% of Alberta's revenue disappear. Not weaken or deteriorate, it's gone.
Final thoughts with Alberta Premier Jim Prentice when we come back.
So I asked myself the question, Don, what moral authority do we as a society have to say to those fellow citizens, you are not entitled to the same thing we are, which is a civil marriage license, not a religious marriage license, but a civil marriage license. And I've concluded that as fellow citizens, they are entitled to the same rights from the government as I am.
There are two other issues I wanted to ask you about that have nothing to do with energy, but they do have something to do with the debates that exist in this province. One is the gay-straight alliance issue.
Right.
Your passion on this subject is clear from the stands you took in Ottawa in terms of on the gay marriage question. You were offside from your party.
I was one of only 3 Conservatives in the entire country to stand up and vote for same-sex marriage back in 2005.
So how difficult is it for you with the debate here in this province for you to set aside this issue, a similar issue, not the same issue, but a similar question?
Issue, for sure.
How difficult is it for you to say, now's not the time to deal with this?
I had been away for that entire week, basically dealing with some of the politics surrounding pipelines. Came back and found that the debate in Alberta was becoming very divisive. And so I essentially said Bill 10, as it's called, would be put on pause. I took personal responsibility for that and accepted responsibility. And since that time, we have been consulting with Albertans, talking with Albertans to try to come up with a solution. And,
but you personally believe in that bill, do you not?
Well, in Bill 10, we were trying to strike a balance. Clearly it wasn't accepted on that basis. It was a difficult debate. I became concerned eventually, really, that the debate could be harmful to young people who had same-sex attraction and who may be vulnerable in other ways. And I felt it was not, it wasn't constructive, and I wanted to stop it because I was worried about kids. And come back to it with some other solution. There is no doubt the government supports gay-straight alliances. The issue has been what kind of a legislative framework or regulatory framework do we create so that other people will be supportive of gay-straight alliances. A very difficult subject. I mean, there's many different points of view. And at the end of the day, it involves the differing rights of different citizens and the balancing of those rights. I'm actually increasingly of the view that we'll find a solution, and I intend to do that before the House resumes.
When would that be?
Well, we're scheduled to come back in March.
And will you come back in March?
Oh, certainly, yes, absolutely.
You have a fixed date election.
We do.
As most of the provinces do, and the federal government, and it's a year from now. But there's constant discussion here and analysis and theories out there that you're going to go early. Or you're going to go for a mandate. You're pretty popular right now, and your opposition seems to be fragmented. What's your commitment on an election?
Well, my dad was a hockey player. He always reminded me, you're only as good as your next shift. And so and never to get too focused on your own press clippings. So I'm reasonable about that. But here's the challenge for me. I ran for the leadership of my party and ultimately through by-elections this fall of the province at a time when oil prices were in excess of $100 per barrel. They began to decline almost the day I was sworn in as the premier.
Oh, so it's your fault.
And so it has produced a serious circumstance for us. We'll get through it. This province is tough and resilient and determined, and you know, we've seen low price environments before. We've seen cycles before. This one's a little different. This one is a little different. Everyone's telling us it's going to be deeper and longer. And so I find myself, you know, as the Premier of the province, dealing with decisions that have to be made that are going to be pretty dramatic. And, you know, to that, Albertans are going to need to look to the government. The government is going to have moral authority to do what needs to be done.
This sounds like a campaign speech.
And I'm going to need to be mandated to do what needs to be done. And I, frankly, I don't think it's fair to the citizens of Alberta to ask them to support a government that hasn't been clear with them about what those solutions and options are. And so that's all I've said. There have been no decisions made. But, you know, I'm interested.
That sounds like a decision to me. I mean, how could you say, oh, well, we don't need an election after what you just said?
Well, I've said this before. I'm the Premier of the province. I'm concerned about probably the most challenging financial circumstances we have been in a generation, for sure, in 25 years in this province. I mean, we have had 17% of Alberta's revenue disappear, not weaken or deteriorate. It's gone in the space of basically 90 days. And every single energy expert and financial analyst I've talked to has said to me, it's not coming back next year or arguably the year after that.
Big challenge.
So tough circumstance. And if we don't, you know, if we don't deal with this in a responsible way, you know, the consequence is we would use up our contingency fund in 8 months. We would go through the entirety of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund in less than 2 years. I mean, this is the severity of the challenge that we're talking about.
Big challenge.
But the province is resilient. And Albertans will rise to the occasion as we have in the past.
Thanks very much for doing this.
Great to be with you. Thank you.